Good morning. For those of you who are watching online, you're going to notice that things are a little bit different. This is our first time where I'm able to have some people come in. And so if you would like to join us next week, we have room for more. We had room for more this morning, so we have about 10 here. I know we can have at least 20, but maybe we can even have more. I'll have to check with Nicole. But just watch on the website for that and sign up if you would like to join us. But it will be a little different, and so I'm asking that for those of you who are viewing online, if you have suggestions, if there are things that you would say, oh, it'd be helpful, in the process if you would do such and such, just let me know. We're learning, and we want to make this a great experience for those who are here, as well as for those who are watching online. So if you can help us out by giving us feedback, that would be wonderful. All right, this morning we're going to start, as we always do, with a time to just get our hearts centered. And so we'll do that with Psalm 46, and then we will proceed into doing Shema, which is the prayer that Jesus would say. So let's begin. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu. Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. B'kol levavka, uv'kol nafsheka, uv'kol meodeka, ve'ahavta v're'aka kamoka amin. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Amen. All right, today we're in the book of Esther. Esther is one of my favorite books. It's just plain fun. There are a lot of different things that happen in the book of Esther. To get started, let's just kind of look where we are geographically. We are in the Persian Empire now. The Persians have taken over from the Babylonians, and we are in a city called Susa. And on this map, it has a different name. It's somewhere in here. So Susa is the name of the city that is kind of their capital city, or at least where the king was. All right, so let me also give you a timeline. Where are we in history? I think it's always important for us to recognize that these aren't just stories that are made up. They're not mythical stories. They're true stories. And so they're stories that happen in a certain place, at a certain time, with real people and people like you and I who are trying to just live life. And so it's important for us to kind of get that context and understand that. So the timeline again is that 538 is when you have Cyrus making the decree that the people can go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. Again, the Persian philosophy is if we can keep all of these gods happy, that's really to our benefit. So let's send the people back to their nations, rebuild their temples, make their gods happy, and then as an empire we will be stronger. So they're sending the Jews back. They allowed them to go back. About 50,000 of them went back in 538 BC. Now, the interesting thing about that is that a couple million did not go back. A couple million are feeling right at home in Babylon, in the whole Persian area, and they decide to stay. And so you have that going on. Let's see, in 515, we have the rebuilding of the temples finally finished. And that's what we talked about last week. We talked about the rebuilding of the temple, how difficult that was, the opposition that was happening in the surrounding villages, and people, tribes, and groups, and it was very difficult for them to get this accomplished. But they finally did it. Basically, they had two prophets who came forward that God used, Haggai and Zechariah, to say, hey, let's get this temple built. It's really important. And so they got it rebuilt. And then Ezra came. Ezra, let's see, he came in about, what year was that? Actually, Ezra comes a little bit later. Today, what we're going to be looking at is that now we have the Persians have a new king. And that happens in about 485 BC. And then about 480, we have a battle that takes place. The Persians and the Greeks fight it out at Thermopylae. So if you've heard of the Battle of Thermopylae, that's where this takes place in time. It actually kind of enters into our story. But if we go back a little bit, 485, we have a new king. His name is Xerxes. If you're looking at the Greek name, if you're looking at the Aramaic name or the Persian name, it would be Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, something like that. All right. That gives us a little bit of a timeline. Now, in the book of Esther, we have some main characters. Let's just kind of get those down right away. Who are our main characters? Shout those out. Mordecai. Who else? Esther. Who else? There's about 4 main characters. Xerxes, the king. Who's kind of, if you want to describe the king, he's kind of a drunken pushover. And you'll see that in the story. One more main character. Haman. He's the villain of the story. Mordecai and Esther would be your stars. Actually, Esther does mean star. The Persian name is Star. Her Hebrew name, anybody know what her Hebrew name was? Hadassah. Hadassah means, what does that mean? I wrote it down somewhere. I'll come back to it in a second. We'll get it. Hadassah and or Esther. And then you have Xerxes the king. Mordecai means warrior. And Haman, who is our villain. Those are our main characters. All right, let's do one other thing before we read the story. There are some distinct features of this story that we'll notice as we read through it. Anybody want to guess what some of those might be? It's about 3 things that come to my mind. Just shout it out if you know one. One is there's lots of feasts. You're going to see lots of banquets, lots of eating, and lots of drinking. So you have a feast happening all the time. All right, so you have feasts. The second thing is that God is never mentioned. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. What makes it interesting is that you begin to notice how God is at work, though, in all kinds of places. And I think that's really helpful for us. Because sometimes, we can live life and we don't mention God, but all of a sudden you start to look and you think, oh gosh, God was at work here. God was at work here. God is at work all the time. Even if he's not mentioned, he's at work. And so we'll see that in the book of Esther. And then there's one other thing that I think is interesting, is that there's all these reversals. Things get reversed. There are several of those. All right. Let's begin. Obviously we can't read all of the text of Esther, but we're going to just try to flow through it and read bits and parts as we go along. Chapter 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, here's India all the way down over here to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel in the 3rd year of his reign. He gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors and the princes were before him. While he showed the riches of his glory, royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So that's about 6 months, so about a half a year of celebrating riches and banquets. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. All right, so notice that, that towards the end of this time, he then gives a feast for all the common people. The common people have 7 days of celebration in his royal garden in his palace. So in this, just notice the decor. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars that, by the way, probably were brought back from Solomon's temple. And also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Notice that little statement, there is no compulsion. Normally, when you are feasting with the king, every time the king took a drink, you would take a drink. All right, the king is saying, all right, you don't have to do that. No compulsion. If I take a drink, doesn't mean you have to take a drink. So it's just one of those little interesting details that come into the text. It probably doesn't serve a lot of purpose, but just kind of fun to notice that these are real people and a real celebration, and there are different things that are happening here. The other thing to notice is that Queen Vashti is also having a feast. She's also celebrating with the women. All right, any comments or questions about this so far? All right, we're going to move on. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. All right, we've got this big feast, lots of drinking, and the drinking keeps going on, and the king's like, hey, let's bring out my beautiful wife, and let's parade her around. You guys can just admire her. Yeah, that is what he wants. And Queen Vashti says, no, I'm not doing it. Well, he's the king. This is the king. And so he's very angry. So he calls his wise men in verse 13, who knew the times, for this was his procedure concerning all who were versed in law and judgment. The men next to him being, and you go through all these names, there are 7, these are princes that are next in command to the king. Verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Well, this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Now, this decree goes out over the whole entire Persian Empire. What's going on here, girls? What is going on? Anybody want to come to the microphone and go for it? Don't be shy. The queen has said no. The king and his buddies say, all right, we're going to stop this right now. Because if we allow this to continue on, all these women in our empire are going to say no to their husbands. And that is not acceptable. So we're going to show these women that they better just listen to their husbands, listen to the men in their lives, and not give them any trouble. So Queen Vashti is deposed. She is removed from her place of position. She's no longer the queen. And the women are all like, okay, now we know our place kind of thing. That's kind of what's going on here. And as we well know, that really doesn't work very well, does it? Doesn't really work. It might work for a while, but it doesn't really work well. So anyway, we have that going on in chapter 1. Some things just don't change. Chapter 2. After these things, all right, we're going to stop right there, because after what things? We've got a few years that have passed. And what has happened in this period of time is that the king and his forces have gone over to the Greek Empire over here. And at the Battle of Thermopylae, there's this huge battle that takes place. Now notice how huge the Persian Empire is. Okay, they take their fleet of ships and they go up. But this is the Greek territory. So what happens is that the Persians actually get defeated here. And so the king comes back home. So after these things means after this battle that he's had with the Greeks, where he's lost, so he's now he's depressed and he's defeated. He's got this, just starting to think, oh, I used to have a queen to come home to, and now I don't have my queen. So he's starting to kind of think about those things. All right, chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. All right, so now we're going to have a beauty pageant. It always reminds me of Cinderella. Let's find the one who's going to be the next queen or the princess. So they have this beauty pageant, and all the beautiful women of the empire are brought together, and they're going to go through all these beauty treatments for months. And so this is where a couple of our main characters come in. Chapter 2, verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of the Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. All right, just quick shout out Who else was from the line of Kish, a Benjaminite, that you remember from the Old Testament? One of our kings. Anybody remember? Saul, King Saul. He was a Kish, the son of Kish. He was a Benjaminite. And it's interesting in the New Testament. Anybody know in the New Testament who was a descendant of the Benjaminites? The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was descended from the Benjaminites. Anyway, that's where, remember, lineage is very important. Ancestry, you always go back, okay, who are my fathers? What tribe did I come from? It's extremely important in Jewish tradition. And it really fits into this story well because we have a situation that's coming up that started with King Saul. All right, so we have Mordecai who's been carried away, and he was bringing up, verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, which means fragrance. I knew I had that written down somewhere. Fragrance, that is Esther, which means star in Persia. The daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother had died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. So the first person that Esther gained favor from was Hegai, the person who's in charge of all the beauty treatments. So she is endeared to him. She wins his favor, and he quickly provides her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to be in the best place in the harem. Isn't that nice? Okay, God is using this. Does God condone this? No. This is not God's design, but God is using this situation to further his plan. And so she's placed at the front of the honor that she has because of what she does. All right. Now, verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Well, think about that for just a second. Why would they not want people to know that they were Jewish? They're in a foreign land. They're in a place, they're really still sojourners. They're not necessarily citizens. They've learned to work here and to make this work, but they're still on the outside. And so he doesn't want to do anything that is going to hinder her progress for what God might want to do in all this situation. So verse 12, now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. So when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, told her. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. All right, so now Esther has become the queen. She is the one that has been chosen amongst all of the beautiful women of Persia. And notice that they have a feast. This is called Esther's feast. But also notice that he says, okay, you guys don't have to pay taxes for a while. It was a time of celebration for everybody in the empire. All right, now we've been introduced to the king, Xerxes. We've introduced to Esther, who is the new queen, Mordecai, who is her uncle and has been in charge, has been her custodian, her guardian after her parents died. We still have yet to meet Haman. But so far we have had these feasts. We have the king in all his greatness. And now we come to a little section that doesn't seem very important, but it turns out to be the pivotal situation for the whole story. In verse 19 of chapter 2. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. Verse 21, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found it to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right, so just a little side note in this story. There are two very unhappy eunuchs, and why they were unhappy we don't know, but they were out to kill the king. And so Mordecai hears about it. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king. These two gentlemen are killed because of what had taken place. And it gets written into the book. Okay. Very simple. Doesn't seem very important, but it becomes a key factor. Chapter 3. Let's meet Haman. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. All right. Now we've got some trouble. We have the second in command, Haman, who is an Agagite. Anybody remember where that comes from? Comes from 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let's go back there for just a second. Remember I said King Saul would come into the story? In chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, God instructs Saul to kill the Amalekites, to wipe them out, because they had been a group of people who had over and over had been cruel and wicked towards the Israelites. When they were in the wilderness for those 40 years, traveling from Egypt to the Promised Land, they went after the Israelites in the wilderness, and they went after the women and the children, the people who were straggling behind, the weak. They went after the weak people. They didn't go to the warriors and fight the men. They went after the women and children. And And if you know God's heart is for those who are weak and who are not as strong, those who need assistance, those who are vulnerable. And so God is angry about that. And God says we cannot allow that group of people to continue on because they are wicked and evil and they will continue to cause trouble. Well, what happens is that Saul goes after this group of people and he wipes out most of them, but he leaves the king. And his name is Agag. So Haman the Agagite is a descendant of King Agag. And he's only a descendant of King Agag because Saul did not wipe them all out. And so he has this long memory of anger towards the Israelite people for what had happened back in 1 Samuel with Saul. And now he's up against Mordecai, who is a descendant of Saul, who is a Jewish man. And so Haman is out now to get the Israelites. So that is an important piece of the story. If you don't know that, you miss a little bit of the understanding of what's going on between Haman and Mordecai. So anyway, Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, and we can see in verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He says, I'm not just going to get rid of Mordecai. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So now we have Haman on the scene, who has been elevated, second in command. And now he is of that mindset. I'm going to kill the Jews. So he puts a plan into place. Starting in verse 7 of chapter 3, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, which means they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So as they're casting lots, or throwing the dice, basically, what month of the year are we going to kill them? And what day in that month are we going to do this? And so it happens that it lands on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So now that's what happens with the pur, casting of the lots. Now he goes to the king, verse 9. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. All right, so the king gives Haman free rein, gives him his ring so that he can make a decree. And once the decree is made, it cannot be revoked. But the king is really oblivious to what's going on. He has no clue what's really happening. It's just like, oh, okay, these people are not doing well, or they don't keep the laws, as Haman was saying, then we need to get rid of them. So he's just taking everything at Haman's word. Verse 12, then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and the governors over the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in their script, in their language. It was written with the seal of the king. Letters were sent by courier to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So that's the decree that went out over the entire empire. Now, it's going to take several months for all of that information to get spread out across the entire empire. But the couriers send it out. And in verse 15, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. Let's just have another party. They're celebrating. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Okay, so there are a lot of people who don't agree with this decree. The people have been here about over 100 years now. They have been living in this land. And they have become part of the fabric of it. They have businesses, they have friends, and so not everyone is excited about what Haman has said. But there are those who are. There are those who are very excited about destroying these Jews, taking their businesses for their own, taking their stuff, their plunder, and being able to do that. All right, so that's what we have at the end of chapter 3. So we have a decree to kill the Jews. Any thoughts, questions? Pretty straightforward. All right. Let's look at chapter 4. Let's see how much time we have. Now we have a little less than a half hour. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, which is a sign of grief and agony. And he put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth, but he did. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So just picture this decree going out across the empire to all of these locations. And there are Jews scattered out all over the world, because from the diaspora and then from the Babylonian exile, we have Jewish people all over the world. In all of these communities, the Jewish people are weeping and beside themselves because they know that they are targeted and they are a minority and they don't have a way to defend themselves. They will be destroyed. It's interesting to me how God is always at work putting the pieces in place ahead of time. How Mordecai and Esther are in a place where they can take a step forward. God knows. He knows what's going to happen. He doesn't cause those things to happen, but he knows the things that are happening, and he finds a way to bring about restoration, to bring about hope, to bring about goodness. All right, verse 4 of chapter 4. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was. She doesn't know yet what the edict is. She doesn't know what's happening. She just knows that Mordecai is grieving, and she knows it's not good for him to be in sackcloth. And so she finds someone to go out to find the truth of what's happening. In verse 7, Mordecai told them all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Now, the king is actually benefiting financially. If you back up, remember he's come off this big war, this big battle with the Greeks, and that's cost him a lot of money. It's cost him a lot of resources. And then he has this big beauty pageant, and Esther becomes queen, and he decides, let's just quit the taxes. So he doesn't really have a lot in his treasury right now, and he's not taxing the people right now. So Haman knows that this will be one way to get the king to move on his side if he's going to give him this money. So this money is going into the king's treasury. So we have that happening. So verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. So Mordecai has said to Esther, you need to go to the king because these are your people. This is you and I. And you need to go to the king and tell him what's going on here. And she says to him, you know what the law of the land is. You may not go see the king unless, if you do approach the king without being asked by the king, you could be killed. The only way it works is if the king holds out his scepter, if he's happy to see you. If he's having a bad day, this is not a good thing because he would just have me killed. Verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Probably some of the most powerful verses in all of Esther. Who knows whether you have not come to the palace for such a time as this. That God has placed you in this position for such a time as this, to speak up no matter what the consequences are. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. All right, in chapter 4, Esther and Mordecai come up with a plan. They're trying to find a way to reverse this decree. And it's on Esther's shoulders. It's to go to the king. And so how do they prepare? How do they get ready for this? They fast and pray. Interesting. We talk about God here, but the fasting on our behalf, not eating, that whole fasting process is a time of taking a step back, waiting on God, letting him know that they are servants of his. They are in his hands. So for 3 days, all Jews are to fast and to pray. All right, chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther puts on her royal robes, regal, stately. Let's see if we've got this is from last week's. I'm sure that's just exactly how she looked. Right? Queen Esther, she puts on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Obviously, she's hit him on a very good day. And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for you tomorrow, and then I will ask you my request." All right. Why procrastinate? I don't know, it just builds the story, doesn't it? There's some great things that happen in here. This whole sense of anticipation and excitement. Notice that Haman and the king are very excited to be at this banquet. And there's great feasting that goes on. That's only her first banquet. So the first banquet that Esther has for them. We note in the rest of the chapter that Haman is so excited. He's just very happy. And then, verse 9, he went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. So he goes from this place of elation and excitement and happiness. He was chosen to go to the queen's banquet with the king. And now there's Mordecai, who does not bow down to him and doesn't even tremble in front of him. At least he could at least look frightened, but he doesn't even look frightened. So he's so angry. He goes home and he brings his friends together and his wife Zeresh, and he tells them about all the things that had taken place, the riches of the king and how the king has honored him and made him such an important person, and that the queen had invited him to this banquet. Everything was going so well. And then there's Mordecai at the king's gate, and he starts to whine and complain. Verse 14, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Well, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." Now this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So this happens in the evening after the first banquet. All right. Any thoughts, questions so far? Chapter 6 is where we have a pivot. Our story pivots at chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep. I kind of think God's behind that, don't you think? Took sleep away from the king that night. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Well, nothing's been done for him." And the king said, "Well, who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he'd prepared. And the king's young men told him, "Well, Haman's there standing in the court." And the king said, "Well, let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king delight to honor? It must be me." And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king said to Haman, 'Hurry, take the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you've mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." All right. You can see, well, everything is just shifted. We've been going this direction. The Jews are going to be destroyed. Haman is in his glory. Everything is going well. And all of a sudden, and so the king hears the message that's been written in the Chronicles and is reminded of the fact that Mordecai had saved him a few years before. And all of a sudden it's like, what do we do for Mordecai? Nothing. Well, we got to do something. So then it just so happens that Haman has stepped in, ready to ask that Mordecai be impaled on this gallows that he's built. And the king asks him a question. He says, well, what should we do to honor someone that should be honored? And he gives this beautiful picture of led through the streets and being honored in such a way. And he says, I want you to do that for Mordecai. At that moment, Haman knows life is not going to be the same. So rather than hanging Mordecai, he is now honoring Mordecai through the streets, which brought great humiliation to himself, because this was the man who he was trying to get rid of. And so he goes back to the house, and he is just in mourning, and Zeresh and his friends like, oh man, this is not good for you, Haman. This is just not good news. So in chapter 7, we have the second banquet. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then they hung Haman on the gallows that were to hang Mordecai. All right, so second banquet, eating, drinking, and the king finally says, "Okay, what can we do?" And she says, "Please spare me and my people. Haman has put this decree out. I am part of the Jewish people." And Haman knows at that moment he's dead. But he begs for mercy. He begs for mercy from the queen. And while he's doing it, the king has left the room. He's so angry. And the king comes back in and he sees Haman begging and pleading before Esther, but he misinterprets it. He sees it as Haman assaulting and attacking his wife, the queen. And he's so angry that they just put a bag over his head. And he is removed and he is hung. Yay! Yay! It's interesting in the celebration that goes in this. They have so much fun with this. The Jewish children are all they cheer. I mean, it's like You have the bad guy, the villain, and the one who is the beautiful princess, and there's cheering, and then there's booing and hissing, and they have all that going on. There's a lot of booing and hissing and a lot of cheering going on just about this time when Haman is killed. All right, that takes care of Haman, but we still have a problem. So we have the reverse of the plan, the reverse of Haman, but we still have an edict that's out there. It's been sealed with the king's signet ring, which means it cannot be changed. So what to do? Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and then gave that to Mordecai. Now Mordecai has been elevated. And he set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan. Change this plan of the Agagite. So when the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, if the thing seems right before the king and I'm pleasing, let an order be written to revoke these letters devised by Haman the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that's coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then he said, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. They've hung him. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring for an edict written in the name of the king, and a new edict that cannot be revoked. All right, so the new edict says this. On the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, the day that has been set aside for the destruction of the Jews, the plunder of all their things, now the Jews can defend themselves. Anybody who tries to kill them or destroy them and take their goods, you can defend yourself, you can fight back, and then you can take their goods. That's what they do. Now, we don't really hear much about it. We just know that, well, let's look at what it says in the end of chapter 8. Mordecai goes out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. They're like, oh, right, okay, it's good to be a Jew. I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. Hey, are you a Jew? So there was that whole new thing that was going on. And in chapter 9, we have what takes place, where on that 13th day, anyone who tried to come forward and kill the Jews to take their property, they were killed instead. I would like to back up just a hair and just think about all the things that are going on in these Jewish communities. First of all, they got the news that they were going to be wiped out, and there wasn't really anything they could do. Then they got the new edict, which says that now they could defend themselves. That meant they had to figure out how to use a sword. How do we do this? How do we defend ourselves? They had to learn. So even those who were Levites, they had to learn how to use a sword, how to use a knife. They had to learn how to defend themselves. And they had that one day where they were going to be attacked. And so you can imagine there's still anxiety, there's still some of this fear that's happening, but not nearly what it was before. So there's still The first edict could not be revoked, but there was a new edict. So you have two edicts in place. One that says you can kill the Jews, the other one that says they're going to fight back. And so it's not going to be as easy as it looks. All right, so I'm sure it deterred many of the Persians from actually fighting. But there would still be some. So on that day, you have chapter 9, verse 2. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought them harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all people. And so we have Mordecai, who's second in command, who has this great position of authority. And we have people who are fearful now of the Jews. And so there is this one day. And then the king gives them an extra day in Susa to carry out the plan to destroy all of Haman's family. And so then all of Haman's family is destroyed on the following day. And we have done what King Saul did not do. Esther and Mordecai accomplished what God's plan, God's purpose was in 1 Samuel 15, and now it is done in the book of Esther. All right. So, of course, there's a feast and a celebration that follows this. Verse 19, therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So it's not only that they feast and celebrate after this event, it's now something they're going to do every year. Every year they're going to remember it. And that is going to be called the Feast of Purim. Taken from the word pur, which was the lot that was thrown to determine what day they were going to be killed. The Feast of Purim. All right, so now we've had Mordecai's plan, Mordecai's edict. Jews are saved by being able to fight back. Mordecai is exalted, and Mordecai's greatness is shown. Mordecai is kind of a Christ figure in this story who brings salvation to his people. All right, I want you to go to, let's see how much time we have left. Oh, we don't have any time left. We're going to quick look at verse 27. The Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation. And so the Jewish people to this day still continue to celebrate this story, the Feast of Purim. I want you to notice the reversal in how things work here. We have begins with King's greatness and it ends with Mordecai's greatness. Haman has been elevated, Mordecai's been elevated. We have the decree to kill the Jews. We have the edict where the Jews can fight back. We have Esther and Mordecai working to reverse that decree, and it gets reversed to where Haman is now killed instead of Mordecai. And so the pivotal point is where the king could not sleep. That is the story of Esther in 1 hour. We did it. No, God does not abandon his people. He does not abandon his promises. He is constantly at work even when we can't see it. Let's pray together. Gracious Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you that you are a God who sees your people. You are a God who sees the difficult circumstances that surrounded Esther and Mordecai, but you also see the circumstances that surround us in our own lives. Lord, you are a God who is always working to restore your people, to restore hope. You're also working to bring us to a place where we recognize our great need for you. And sometimes we can live life pretty freely without even recognizing that we need you. And Lord, in these days, I think it's more apparent to us how much we need you. We need you all the time. We ask that you continue to remind us that we would seek your heart, we would seek your goodness, that we would seek your direction, your wisdom, your discernment for our own lives. And Lord, watch over and protect us. Guide our church, guide our communities, guide our nation as we seek to find ways to bring wholeness, to bring healing, to bring hope to our people. Go with us now in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.